A century ago, when the Victorian age had scarcely begun to be a focus of scholarly examination, perhaps the most influential of all studies of the period opened with the provocative assertion that the history of the Victorian age will never be written. We know too much about it. 100 years later, even though they have largely passed out of direct memory, it remains even more the case that we know too much about the Victorians to render them in 35,000 words without systematic and often flagrant simplification. Every characterization in this book is defenseless against the challenge that it underestimates complexity, smooths over unevenness, and excludes difference, that it offers a totalizing account which would dissolve on closer scrutiny. Indeed, any impression to the contrary must be tenaciously resisted. The listener should be under no illusion. Victorian Britain was a mass of tensions and contradictions, of inconsistencies and incompatibilities, of instabilities and competing subjectivities. It was fiercely insular and determinedly global, the railway age and the heyday of the horse, both smug and anxious, a time of extraordinary change but also of remarkable continuities, producing enormous wealth and pitiless poverty. Patterns were always under construction, conventions never uncontested. All characterizations of the Victorian, and in particular all formulations of what the Victorians did or thought in the upcoming sections, must be prefaced with a silent, on balance, on the whole, or predominantly, omitted in the interests of economy and elegance. None of this inevitable historical messiness is any reason not to generalize or to attempt to sketch the broad patterns and norms around which diversity was arrayed, and this is especially so in the case of the Victorians, partly because Victorian culture was shared across all classes and groups to a remarkable extent, the intellectual life of the period profoundly structured by pervasive underlying assumptions, languages and reference points, partly because Victorian Britain was marked by particularly powerful social norms and expectations bearing down on, to a greater or lesser extent, all parts of society. Partly because in exploring the shades and balances of the period, writings about the Victorians, including those by the Victorians themselves, have very often begun with a general interpretation which they have proceeded to dismantle or subvert. The Victorians, as the historian John Darwin has put it, agreed on generalities but differed in detail, and it is only by comprehending the general pattern that we can fully understand the nature of the diversity. As historians have long recognized, one of the most difficult challenges in studying any period in the past is getting a sense of the particular combination of ways of thinking and ways of living which characterized it. This is perhaps especially true of the Victorians, because the Victorian period has been the site of a set of particularly rich engagements from a variety of perspectives, which have not always, indeed perhaps rarely, successfully balanced the two poles of thinking and living. In what follows, I have tried to develop a portrait of the period which explores the mutually constitutive operations of experience, action and reflection. I do so by addressing 5 questions which seem to me to be critical in approaching the Victorians.